Not only is secularization the move, the second one and quickly is pluralization, where there's a competing number of worldviews available to its members and no one worldview is dominant. Where there's a competing number of worldviews available to its members and no worldview is dominant. Now, I could easily go into the philosophical aspect of how the law of non-contradiction works in society, but I won't belabor that for you, except to show you how the outworking of not believing in an absolute manifests itself. Steve Turner, the journalist in England, incisively gives this tongue-in-cheek, calling it the creed of the atheists. We believe in Marx, Freud, and Darwin. We believe everything is okay, as long as you don't hurt anyone to the best of your definition of hurt and to the best of your definition of knowledge. We believe in sex before, during, and after marriage. We believe in the therapy of sin. We believe that adultery is fun. We believe that taboos are taboo. We believe that everything is getting better despite evidence to the contrary. The evidence must be investigated and you can prove anything with evidence. We believe there's something in horoscopes, UFOs and bent spoons. Jesus was a good man just like Buddha, Muhammad and ourselves. He was a good moral teacher, although we think some of his morals were basically bad. We believe that all religions are basically the same, at least the ones that we read were. They all believe in love and goodness. They only differ on matters of creation, sin, heaven, hell, God, and salvation. We believe that after death comes the nothing, because when you ask the dead what happens, they say nothing. If death is not the end, and if the dead have lied, then it's compulsory heaven for all except perhaps Hitler, Stalin, and Genghis Khan. We believe in Masters and Johnson. What's selected is average, what's average is normal, what's normal is good. We believe in total disarmament. We believe there are direct links between warfare and bloodshed. Americans should beat their guns into tractors and the Russians would be sure to follow. We believe that man is essentially good. It's only his behavior that lets him down. This is the fault of society. Society is the fault of conditions. Conditions are the fault of society. We believe that each man must find the truth that is right for him and reality will adapt accordingly. The universe will readjust, history will alter. We believe that there is no absolute truth except the truth that there is no absolute truth. We believe in the rejection of creeds and the flowering of individual thought. Notice the postscript now. If chance be the father of all flesh, disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear state of emergency, sniper kills 10, troops on rampage, bomb blast school, it is but the sound of man worshipping his maker. The violence we see is the result of that creed. Notice how Chesterton words it. The new modern rebel is a skeptic and therefore does not trust anything. He has no loyalty, therefore he can never be a true revolutionist. The fact that he doubts everything gets in his way when he wants to denounce anything. For all denunciation implies a moral doctrine of some kind. And the modern revolutionist doubts not only the institution he denounces, but the doctrine by which he denounces it. Thus, he writes one book complaining that imperial oppression insults the purity of women, then he writes another book, a novel, in which he insults it himself. He curses the Sultan because Christian girls lose their virginity, then curses Mrs. Grundy because they keep it. As a politician, he cries out that war is a waste of life, and then as a philosopher that all life is a waste of time. A Russian pessimist will denounce a policeman for killing a peasant, then prove by the highest philosophical principles that the peasant ought to have killed himself. A man denounces marriage as a lie, and then denounces aristocratic profligates for treating it as a lie. He calls the flag a bauble, then blames the oppressors of Poland or Ireland because they take away that bauble. The man of this school goes first to a political meeting where he complains that savages are treated as if they were beasts. Then he takes his hat and umbrella, goes on to a scientific meeting where he proves that they practically are beasts. In short, the modern revolutionist, being an infinite skeptic, is always engaged in undermining his own minds. In his book on politics, he attacks men for trampling on morality. In his book on ethics, he attacks morality for trampling on men. The modern man in revolt has become practically useless for all purposes of revolt by rebelling against everything. He's lost his right to rebel against anything.
Spotted. That's the two coming your way. I think it was another.
So what I say I say with this qualification because I'm not criticizing the opposition here or those who are giving us a hearing. But I happen to be on that radio talk program which some of you have heard, I know. And on that program there was hostility. Oh, some of them right from the beginning. As Hugh Ross from California and I were on this open line together for 1 hour, our host was an atheist. And all of a sudden in the middle, one woman phoned up rather irate, very angry. She said, I know what your agenda is, as men and as Christians. I know what your agenda is. And she somehow brought out the whole issue of abortion. I said, Madam, did either of us even mention that issue? That is not even the issue under debate. She says, I know, but that's what's behind all of this talk anyway. And she said, I cannot accept the right of God in this and that. And she really began to get irate and angry and wouldn't even let us talk. I said, all right, can you just allow me to ask you one question? Just one question. If you answer my question, I'll let it go. Since you brought it up, I said, Madam, this is my question to you. You have just spent the last few minutes defending your absolute right as a moral right to make the determination of what you have called your own body and that life within your body. You've arrogated to yourself that absolute right and you call it your moral right to do as you will. I said, I've been on campuses where somebody has said something like this. A plane crashed in such and such a place. 50 people died, 20 people lived. What kind of a God are you worshipping who arbitrarily chooses 50 to die and 20 to live? He's not a very good God, is he? Not a very moral God. I said, can you explain this conundrum for me? When God is blamed for arbitrary choices, that he allowed some to live and some to die, and you call him evil. When you give to yourself that right to determine the life of someone else, you call it a moral right. Can you explain this contradiction for me? Click. Now we're discussing all these things about gun laws and all, and it's very important to discuss it. Very important to discuss it. We need to understand these things. But you know what's forgotten oftentimes? That it takes 3 components to do a killing. It takes a person, it takes a weapon, and it takes ammunition. And we think ammunition is only in the form of a bullet. Have you ever thought of the ammunition that comes across the airways, that pours hate into a person's mind? The ammunition that dehumanizes people? The ammunition that does not know how to treat your fellow human being with respect? The ammunition of sensuality, of depravity? Even in our elections, the words that are used are so aggressive and vitriolic and sometimes hostile. One candidate running for election in America, when he was running for office, told people to go and vote. It was the best form of revenge. Wow. Is that what something so noble as a vote is all about? Revenge? Not to make righteousness grow? This is the kind of ammunition we are pouring into young minds. And some of this stuff goes on and on and on. And it is easier for us to point to an instrument rather than try to understand the depravity and the horror of the human heart. Malcolm Muggeridge put it in these words. He said 2 things. One is very simply stated and the other is rather in a complex way stated, so please follow me in both of them. He said this: the depravity of man is at once the most empirically verifiable fact, even at the same time that it is the most intellectually resisted. Hear what he's saying? The depravity of man is the most empirically verifiable fact, is the most obvious thing to see, but at the same time it is the most intellectually resisted. We don't want to accept it because that takes us into theological terrain and the purpose of life. And then he said this in the 70s, shortly after he resigned from his chaplaincy at the University of Edinburgh in his last talk at St. Giles. He made some comments and he said, it is difficult to resist the conclusion that 20th century man has decided to abolish himself. Tired of the struggle to be himself, he has created boredom out of his own affluence, impotence out of his own erotomania, vulnerability out of his own strength. He himself blows the trumpet that brings the walls of his own cities crashing down, until at last, having educated himself into imbecility, having drugged and polluted himself into stupefaction, he keels over a weary, battered old brontosaurus and becomes extinct. Now, this comes from a man who was one-time editor of Punch magazine. He said he had the most difficult job in the world of trying to make the English laugh. And then he went on to become more sober-minded himself when he realized what was happening to Western culture. In the 1970s, he made that statement, and what we are seeing now, as that has been going on for the last several decades. I want to talk to you this afternoon in the time that I have. What is apologetics going to have to look like in this 21st century? What do I mean by apologetics? Apologetic comes from the Greek word apologia, which literally brings in two convergent strands. Number one is a defense of the Christian faith in Christian terms. You are presenting an apologia, which actually means to give an answer to. The Apostle Peter in Acts chapter 2, when they are confused of the descent of the Holy Spirit, he says, let me explain. Let me give you an apologetic. This is that which was spoken of by the prophet Joel. When Peter is writing again after having that extraordinary experience on that Mount of Transfiguration and all, he writes, we now have the word of prophecy more certain. And then he goes on to say, always be prepared to give an apologia for the hope that is within you. Always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that is within you. So one strand is that of reasoning and argument, but then there is another strand in apologetics, which is to clarify truth claims. You're making something clear that seemed rather muddied or ambiguous or vague prior to that. So the task of the apologist is to give a clear presentation of the gospel and to be able to stand and to defend that gospel in the light of contrary worldviews. That's the difficult task of Christian apologetics, and we are all apologists. The only difference could be some could be doing a good job at it and some could be doing a not so good job at it. We're all called to give a reason for the hope that is within us. So let me give for you some descriptions of what has happened in Western culture, particularly in the previous century, and then bring to you a response of what I think it is going to take from the church to respond to our times. The first is this: the popularization of the death of God. The popularization of the death of God movement. What do I mean by that? In the year 1900, the most famous atheist of the previous century passed away. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche is the German philosopher whose father was a pastor, both of whose grandfathers were in the ministry. Nietzsche lost his faith in God. And the irony of it is that he said, when we actually find out that God has died in the 19th century, he said two things are going to happen in the 20th century. The 20th century will become the bloodiest century in history, said he, and a universal madness will break out. The 20th century will become the bloodiest century in history, and a universal madness would break out. Ironically, he took the latter step in his own life. In the last 13 years of his life, he spent insane. And his mother testified that while she sat by his side, this brilliant philosopher, many think he died of having contracted venereal disease and other complications came in, but this brilliant philosopher went into silence for weeks and weeks and weeks at a time, while his mother would sit by his bedside and suddenly would break out of that silence. And what would he say in the midst of that? Verses of scripture that he had learned as a younger boy. And was he right about the 20th century? We killed more people in the 20th century than the previous 19 put together. But he's the one who popularized the phrase, God is dead, God has died. But then he went on to use metaphors like this: who gave us a sponge to wipe away the horizon? Is there any up or down left? Must lanterns now have to be lit in the morning hours? What sacred games will we need to invent to help us cope
with this the greatest of deeds that humanity has ever done. He said that. You see, he realized the ramifications of a godless existence were immense. No up or down, no horizon, no light by which to walk. He recognized that, and he struggled with this in his own heart, as did Charles Darwin. If nature is red in tooth and claw, that redness is going to continue if you're going to survive, because there is no God. So Nietzsche popularized the phrase, God is dead. But he struggled with the ramifications. Not so now. Now you've got people like Richard Dawkins and all triumphantly saying, at last we've been liberated from this kind of nonsense and tooth fairy belief. The irony of a man like Dawkins is that he was professor at Oxford University, a university that was founded with the motto, the Lord is my light. The Lord is my light. Now what has happened is we are willing to live with the strident ramifications of a no-God universe. That's the difference. It's not so much that we've come to the conclusion that God has died, but that we're willing now to actually believe it's okay. We clench our fist. We've been liberated. Aldous Huxley said it in the 40s, I want this world not to have meaning, because a meaningless world, he says, frees me to pursue my own political and erotic ideas and ideologies. What do I mean by this? So Dawkins came to Washington to get together a lot of atheists in a kind of a rah-rah type of a campaign. And somebody from the audience asked him, what do we do then with those who believe in God? And Dawkins said, mock them. His answer from the platform, mock them, ridicule them. Somebody wrote to me and asked me, what do I think of that suggestion? I said, I think it's a great idea, and I think Dawkins should go and start that in Saudi Arabia. There's bad news that'll follow, but the good news is he'll only need a one-way ticket. Why? Because he will at least find out that all religions are not created equal. There's a world of a difference in the fine points, in the footnotes, and the distinctives of a worldview, especially the worldview to which you and I are committed in the pursuit and the love of Jesus Christ. Number two, it's the power of the gathering storm that came about through a disoriented Western culture and an invasive, neutralizing Eastern philosophy. Now, this is not to talk about East as good and West as bad. That's not what I'm saying. I'm talking about a worldview where it was suddenly assumed that the mystical and that which maybe was not yielding to the laws of normal scrutiny and logic could easily be absorbed into your living and your lifestyle. My last book was called Why Jesus? I'd actually wanted to call it From Oprah to Chopra, but the publisher wouldn't let it go that way. So they've called it, they gave it a long subtitle. I have a hard time remembering the subtitle. It's called Why Jesus? And it's subtitled this way, Rediscovering His Truth in an Age of Mass-Marketed Spirituality. And I take a look at the great mystics from Swami Vivekananda and Yogananda and Maharishi Mahesh Yogi with the transcendental meditation philosophy and all of that, and show how it came into the West and disoriented ideas of true spirituality. Swami Vivekananda came to the United States in 1893, and in the middle of his talk, he wasn't an invited speaker, he's a brilliant man, but he walked up at the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago, and uninvited he said this and took the conference by storm. We who come from the East have sat here on the platform day after day and have been told in a patronizing way that we ought to accept Christianity because Christian nations are the most prosperous. We look about us and see England, the most prosperous Christian nation in the world, with her foot on the the neck of 250 million Asiatics. We look back into history and see that the prosperity began with the invasion of Mexico. Christianity wins its prosperity by cutting the throats of its fellow human beings. At such a price, the Hindu will not have prosperity. I have sat here today and I have heard the height of intolerance. I've heard the creeds of the Muslims applauded when the Muslim sword is carrying destruction into India. Blood and sword are not for the Hindu, whose religion is based on the laws of love. A round of applause went through the whole auditorium. All of the universities in America were opened up to Swami Vivekananda, and he made an enormous impact with a partial truth covered with an unfortunate untruth. What is the untruth? You never ever judge a system by its abuse. You never ever judge a system by its abuse. Do I judge Hinduism by the way they put Graham Staines and his boys into a van and doused it with kerosene and burned them to death? Do I go stand up and say that's what Hinduism is all about? What would he say to that? The fact of the matter is, you evaluate and analyze what it is that ultimately defines us as human beings. You know, in the American Declaration of Independence, there's an absolutely fabulous line. It's a fabulous line. And the founders and framers of those ideas were brilliant in the way they framed it. You look at the documents and you see how marvelously framed it is. We consider these truths to be self-evident. What is self-evident? That all men are created equal. Says who? Not the naturalist, not the pantheist with a caste system. Only in the Judeo-Christian worldview are we created equal. That we are all created equal with the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These truths were considered self-evident. They would call it natural law, but it was not just said by the Creator, endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights. It's a gift of God, not of the state. It's a gift of God, that we're all created equal and endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I dare you to find any other worldview that would have penned this line other than the Judeo-Christian worldview. It's a great line. And what we find now, all of a sudden, we who live in the West, and I've lived in the West now for 40 years. I was 20 years old when I left India, and my dad emigrated to Canada. 10 years in Canada, then on to the United States. And I've watched the total self-immolation of the West at the hands of its own intellectuals and at the hands of its own thinkers, who've taken away the most sacred truths of life's essential and intrinsic worth, and the entailments were unbelievable. You know, God gave only one prohibition in the garden. Don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Only one law. Because they broke that, Moses had to give 613. Have you ever gone onto a plane and they tell you no smoking is allowed, and you're not allowed to tamper, disable, or destroy the smoke detector? Why all this qualification stuff? Just say don't mess with it. Don't mess with the smoke detector. But because if you get a lawyer into the room, he could tell you I tampered with it, but I didn't destroy it. All these, you know, one lawyer friend in America was telling me in a court of law, when you ask a person if he was ever alone with this victim, he could actually say, no, I was never alone in the room with that person, because in his mind he can say, if two of us are in the same room, I'm not alone. He said every word has to be so carefully fine-tuned, because the human heart is able to pervert and redefine everything. All that came about because we redefined good and evil. That's the way it is. And I bring to you today this challenge to ask yourself, what made the West give it its greatness? May I suggest to you there were entailments from the Judeo-Christian worldview that gave it the knowledge and the wisdom to know when things were wrong. What brought William Wilberforce to fight against slavery? Was it a political theory? Why did he give 50 years of his life for that? Till he was on his deathbed. When the news came that the law had finally been passed, and after 50 years of battling for it, he said, thank God. He wouldn't settle for it partially before, because he saw the image of God and the intrinsic worth of every human being, essentially so, not existentially merely, but essentially. The first change that took place was the death of God and the ramifications with which we are willing to live. Number two, the whole gathering storm of a changing worldview, and the West unable to understand much of its own worldview, how it came about. And number three, the power to inform through the visual. The power to inform through the visual. This is a defining manner in our times. William Blake put these words about the eyes brilliantly. He said this life's dim windows of the soul distorts the heavens from pole to pole and goads you to believe a lie when you see with and not through the eye. This life's dim windows of the soul distorts the heavens from pole to pole and goads you to believe a lie when you see with and not through the eye. What Blake is telling us is that we are intended to see through the eye with the conscience, and oftentimes we now see with the eye devoid of a conscience. The circumscription of the visual, where in 5 seconds of a soundbite we think we now understand the news. That's really what we think. We can take a text devoid of a context, make it look like a pretext, and go on with it. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. What happens in your living room and my living room at night, or your bedroom and my bedroom at night when you're watching television? You may be an adult now who can see through this stuff, but think of the kids. How you plant a seed like a paper cut to the soul. You just cut into that soul early. And what goes on then as they nurture that without the maturity to be able to handle it. And all that goes on in our entertainment now, the two things that entertain us most are really violence and sensuality. That's what entertains us most. And they are telling us that kids now at the age of 11 and 12 are getting hooked onto pornography and the decimation of the mind to a point that is planting the seeds for the destruction of marriage in the years ahead. It's a fact. You're meant to see through the eye with the conscience. What did Simone Weil say? In reality, nothing is so beautiful as the good. Nothing so monotonous and boring as evil, but with our imagination it's the other way around. Fictional good is boring and flat. Fictional evil is varied, intriguing, attractive, and full of charm. Nothing is so beautiful as the good. Nothing so monotonous and boring as evil. But in our imagination it's the other way around. Fictional good is boring and flat. Fictional evil is varied, intriguing, attractive, and full of charm. And he said, and this thing, night after night, is used by those moguls who know how to bypass the front door of reason and get in through the back door of the imagination. The very point of entrance that Satan used at the garden. Did God really say? No. You become God, when you do this. And you take hold of a person's imagination and you've got him. You've got him.
That. It's Better News Galaxy. It's time to travel the highway to hell.
We look back upon history and what do we see? Empires rising and falling, revolutions and counter-revolutions, wealth accumulated and wealth dispersed. Shakespeare has spoken of the rise and fall of great ones that ebb and flow with the moon. I look back upon my own fellow countrymen of England, once upon a time dominating a quarter of the world, most of them convinced in the words of what is still a popular song, that the God who made them mighty shall make them mightier yet.
I've heard a crazed, cracked Austrian announce to the world the establishment of a German Reich that would last 1,000 years. I've seen an Italian clown saying he was going to stop and restart the calendar with his own ascension to power. I've seen a murderous Georgian brigand in the Kremlin, acclaimed by the intellectual elite of the world as a wiser than Solomon, more humane than Marcus Aurelius, more enlightened than Ashoka. I have seen America more wealthier and in terms of military weaponry more powerful than the rest of the world put together, so that had the American people so desired, they could have outdone a Caesar or an Alexander in the range and scale of their conquest. All in one lifetime, all in one lifetime, all gone, gone with the wind. England, part of a tiny island off the coast of Europe, threatened with dismemberment and even bankruptcy. Hitler and Mussolini dead, remembered only in infamy. Stalin is a forbidden name in the regime he helped found and dominate for some 3 decades. America is haunted by fears of running out of the precious fluids that keeps the motorways roaring and the smog settling, with painful memories of a disastrous campaign in Vietnam and the victory of the Don Quixotes of the media as they charged the windmills of Watergate. All in one lifetime, all in one lifetime, all gone with the wind. Behind the debris of the fallings of our solemn supermen and imperial diplomatists lies the gigantic figure of one person, because of whom, by whom, in whom, and through whom mankind may still survive, the person of Jesus Christ.
kind of a maniac, so I move it in and we unpack. It's the same as yesterday. Anyway we flow, everything must go away. What do you say? Yeah. You don't know my mind, you don't know my kind. Dark necessities are part of my design. Tell the world that I'm falling from the sky. Dark necessities are part of my design.